Marissa Coyne, and as our hosts just shared, I'll be presenting today with my colleague Melissa Womack. We'll be talking about Gardeners with Heart, 5 years of equity-focused volunteer recognition. We're just so thrilled to be here with all of you today. So good morning for those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. We had a strong showing I saw earlier from Pennsylvania. That's where I'm from originally, Montgomery County, although these days I'm based in Davis, California. Today, we're going to talk about volunteer recognition, but we're going to take you through it's sort of a research to practice session. And we're going to describe a volunteer recognition program that we've developed and implemented over the last several years for the University of California Master Gardener Program. As I mentioned a moment ago, my name is Marissa Coyne, and I'm the Assistant Director for Volunteer and Community Engagement with the UC Master Gardener Program. And I'm joined by Melissa Womack. And Melissa is the Assistant Director for Impact and Communications. Morning, Melissa.
Good morning, everyone. So happy to be here today.
Today's objectives will be to take our time together to explain the limitations of relying solely on tenure or status-based volunteer recognition approaches. We hope that you'll be able to identify one or more research-based strategies to improve equity in volunteer recognition. And then finally, we hope you'll be able to describe some features or elements of an impact-based volunteer recognition program. And the example that we'll lift up is our Gardeners with Heart program. So having covered those objectives, we'll talk about our agenda.
Okay, first, a housekeeping item. I just want to let everyone here know that you don't have to take notes, or we've made it really easy to capture some of the resources that we're sharing today. At the end of the presentation, we will have a QR code and we will share a link to the presentation. It will include the slide deck and all of the other resources that we're sharing. And as mentioned in the chat, we will have hopefully a few minutes at the end. We're hoping to save about 10 minutes at the end to answer questions. For our agenda today, we are going to begin with a brief overview of the University of California and the Master Gardener Program. We'll talk a little bit about our history and the historical recognition practices of our program and why we really saw a need to shift or change some of the practices that were in place. And then we'll go over steps that we took to implement a new program. And then finally, we'll review some of the outcomes and some of the happy little surprises that we learned along the way. All right. Going into just a really brief background or history about the program, we thought it'd be fun to share. This is actually the very first graduating class in California. It's in Sacramento. It took place in 1980. We'll see we have all the great outfits in here. And it's just a nice throwback to say we've been around, our program has been around 45 plus years. So we have a really rich history. So that's the first picture on the bottom left. We also have our graduating class in Alameda County in 1981. That's the beautiful ladies in the top right corner. And then below that is an example of the ways we used to do outreach in the malls in the 80s, where it was like really just a community hub where we had plant clinics and just events in the mall. So I thought that was kind of a nice throwback to some of the historical of the Master Gardener Program. Today, though, in 2026, the Master Gardener Program is in 52 counties across the state, and we have more than 6,300 active volunteers. And much like the rest of the national EMG programs across the country, our mission is to extend research-based information and knowledge on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable gardening practices to residents of California.
So that's the history of the UC Master Gardener Program in a single slide. We want to share the history of our volunteer recognition programs and also point out some of the limitations that we saw that we were hoping to address with a new program. So our volunteer recognition program or practices pre-2020, what did they look like? Well, at the statewide level, we recognized volunteers through title changes. So as they acquired more hours, they would maybe move into a gold badge or a platinum badge. They would receive pins and they would receive badges that would reflect their achievement. And then finally, we would include those volunteers in lists that we would publish to our website or include in our impact reports. All of that occurs at the statewide level, but at the local level, there was a lot of diversity in terms of the ways that volunteers were recognized for their contributions. This might look like hosting an event like a barbecue or a volunteer appreciation day sort of celebration. And then we also see that there were like newsletter features of volunteers who had made contributions or achieved some milestones or taken on some unique leadership roles. It's important to note that all of these practices are still important. What we're proposing today is not that you throw out everything that you've been doing in the past. We continue to utilize these pre-2020 volunteer recognition practices, but what we're advancing today is a case for looking at the opportunity to incorporate some research-based practices around impact. So what were the limitations? What did we see as limitations with exclusively focusing on kind of tenure or leadership roles? Well, we saw that we were celebrating volunteers who had long tenures. So these were the volunteers who continued to show up in those impact reports, having contributed tons of hours or had a relationship with the UC Master Gardener program for many years. We also saw that this was really lifting up volunteers who were in formal leadership roles and really, again, prioritized contributions of large volunteer hours, which not everyone can achieve. We saw that the honorees continue to reflect historical volunteer demographics. And we know from our demographic data survey here in the University of California that the vast majority of our volunteers are white, female identified, retired from work outside the home, and over the age of 65 with a college degree or greater. But we see that we have growth in our Hispanic Latino volunteer population and Asian American population. And yet those folks weren't necessarily receiving recognition. So what we saw was that we needed to maybe look at a potential equity issue with our current practices. Finally, our volunteer recognition practices were largely confirmatory. I'm going to show a slide in a second that kind of shares a little bit more of what we mean when we talk about confirmatory versus discretionary. But what this means is that awards are distributed after specific measurable thresholds are met. So you received 1,000 hours, you have a badge color change, right? So these were confirming achievements that volunteers had made. Our next slide is going to talk about what are the consequences of doing nothing, of retaining our volunteer recognition practices as is. What are the repercussions of the status quo where volunteer recognition is concerned? Well, the research is pretty clear that volunteer recognition is a proven retention strategy, and that the strongest effects occur when we use formal discretionary recognition. So if you look to the right, there is a model that comes from a research study that was looking at volunteer recognition and recognition in the workplace. And you'll see that there are two axes. There's a formal, informal, and a confirmatory discretionary. And what the research has found is that formal discretionary volunteer recognition has the strongest effect on volunteer satisfaction and retention. We also found that volunteers from underrepresented groups reported lower satisfaction and intent to remain. This is true in a study from Bonison and others, and that there's a need for improved inclusion at the peer and supervisor levels. We also wanted to look at formal and informal exclusion from leadership roles as a possible factor that could prevent folks from receiving recognition that would be tied specifically to leadership roles. So as volunteer organizations, extension volunteer programs, the UC Master Gardener program, prioritize equity and inclusion in volunteer engagement, it's important that we look at our retention practices, which includes our volunteer recognition practices. And we concluded that focusing only on tenure and status may risk leaving out newer volunteers or volunteers whose social identities may not be well represented in the broader volunteer population. So we thought, we can do better. So we decided that we wanted to make some changes and to take on a new approach. And what we're going to talk about today is what we did, and we're also going to share some of the results. So our new approach had research-based criteria that addressed our organizational needs. We wanted to center community impact over tenure. We wanted to ensure that our volunteer recognition practices were tied specifically to our mission and to our impact areas that we wanted to lift up and celebrate, to be able to communicate to volunteers about the difference that they're making in the community. And we wanted to engage this idea of like personal narrative, which we know from our communications research, from my communications colleague, can be very transformational and a very compelling way of communicating about impact. We wanted to develop a process for nominating volunteers that would respect the administrative burden that is working in extension, and reduce that burden for local colleagues. And we wanted to have a sort of democratic process with representative results, which sort of meant that if effort was put into nominating a volunteer, we wanted to figure out a way to share that story. And so we didn't want to create a hierarchy of first, second, third, in terms of those who would be recognized. So our next set of slides, we'll talk about, okay, this is what we thought we wanted to do. What did we actually do to put the plan into action? Melissa?
All right, perfect. Thank you, Marissa. So now, as Marissa described, we kind of reimagined what our recognition approach could be for California. And I'm going to talk through how we brought that plan into life. In the next couple of slides, we'll go through some of the communication strategies, and then really how we even continue to celebrate and recognize our volunteers today as we are entering year 6 of this volunteer recognition campaign. Next slide. All right. So we started all of this back in 2019. We started the planning or the thinking or the re-envisioning of the volunteer recognition. And back in 2019, we decided, let's name this campaign Gardeners with Heart. So if you hear that, that's what this new volunteer recognition campaign in California is. It's the Gardeners with Heart campaign. And we were thinking about timing. And so we needed some time to prepare. We were kind of doing visioning back in 2019. And in 2020, we decided to officially launch Gardeners with Heart. And when deciding when in 2020 would be the best time, we landed on April. And the reason we decided to do Gardeners with Heart and volunteer recognition in April is because it lines up perfectly with both National Volunteer Month and National Gardening Month, which gives us the opportunity to align with broader celebrations and already existing campaigns and events that are taking place across the social media and communications landscapes. It's also worth noting that without our knowledge, COVID happened in 2020 and in April of 2020. So this was really early pandemic when we launched the campaign. And while people couldn't be physically together, it created an opportunity for Master Gardeners to still feel very much connected in community. So while there was challenges with COVID, launching the campaign during 2020 actually helped bring us together and make meaningful connections as we kicked off the volunteer celebrations in April of 2020. All right, so to bring Gardeners to Heart with Life, we really developed a communication strategy around 4 main steps. The first step, and I'll go into detail along all of these slides, the first step was our pre-program preparations, and then our internal communications. So how are we going to communicate and really rally our local program leadership and volunteers, and then post-nomination collection, and then developing an external campaign with our community partners and the public to celebrate the volunteers themselves. All right, so step 1 is our pre-program launch. So this is where probably the biggest lift is in the beginning. So before launching Gardeners with Heart, we really laid the groundwork to ensure a smooth and inclusive rollout. We started by socializing the concepts with all of our internal stakeholders, with our county coordinators, our advisors, our county directors, making sure that they really understood the purpose and had the tools that they needed to help support the campaign locally. We also developed visual identities like the Gardeners with Heart campaign mark, which you'll see in the top right corner, which is the gardening gloves holding a plant that's shaped like a heart, and the recognition certificate on the bottom right corner, just to help create a consistent, cohesive campaign across the program. All right. Also, as part of our pre-launch, we included a nomination survey using Qualtrics. We kept it open for about 3 weeks to give enough time for staff and volunteers to really collect a lot of information about the work volunteers were doing. And we invited staff, volunteers, and community partners to submit, because sometimes volunteers might want to nominate another volunteer, and they might be really closely connected to the work that's taking place that they're doing alongside someone. So we really wanted to make it open and just available for people to submit. Our goal was to make the survey quick, easy, but still gather very rich information and content that we could use when we went into the creation portion. So we collected project details, impact highlights, photos, and other visuals that help bring every volunteer story to life as we work through some of the content that we're creating. All right. Additionally, on the internal communications plan, we really had these two buckets, the coordinators and the volunteers. For the coordinators, we hosted webinars about the new approach to volunteer recognition. We also sent personalized emails, and we followed up with targeted outreach to ensure that every county had the chance to participate. We provided email reminders during the nomination window and helped troubleshoot alongside any of the coordinators if they had any barriers to entry. So if they encountered any trouble with the survey or they had questions about the nomination process. And then on the other side, volunteers heard about the campaign through direct email, through newsletters. We also have what we call a volunteer management system, or VMS. We posted internal announcements in that space, and we really counted on the word of mouth from local leadership. We also engaged volunteers directly post-nomination by requesting images and giving the volunteers an opportunity to tell their story. So they were nominated, and then we have this rich information from the nominee, but then we followed up with the volunteers individually and asked if they had anything additional to share about their story or the work that they're doing. All right, so then we move into kind of the post nominations and selections. Once nominations closed, we shifted into the selection and storytelling phase. And when I say selection, anyone that was nominated is being awarded a Gardeners with Heart award, and they are being celebrated. So the selection part is easy. They've already been selected and identified by their fellow volunteers and their coordinators. And then we move into the storytelling phase. How can we really showcase and share the impactful work that they're doing? So we carefully reviewed all of the submissions. We looked for alignment across impact categories to ensure that we had a broad representation, and we kind of put volunteers together based on the themes of the work that they're doing. Additionally, we personally reached out to congratulate each honoree, and we collect anything that was missing from their nomination packet. So if we needed more images or a quote or anything that we could really use to capture the heart of the work that they're doing in their community. At this stage, it was our goal to really amplify the voices of our volunteers and make sure that we shared all of their stories in a way that felt really meaningful to them and authentic to their voice. You'll see here is a picture of an amazing Master Gardener volunteer. Her name is Florence Nishida. She was nominated and recognized in 2023 for her time teaching vegetable gardening in South Los Angeles. She has made gardening accessible to countless new gardeners, many of which these gardeners are from low-income backgrounds across LA County. She's also the co-founder of LA Green Grounds and has helped convert vacant spaces into edible gardens, creating a network of community gardens across South Los Angeles. She really has played a pivotal role in legalizing edible gardening in parkways across the city and has helped increase food access to residents in food deserts. So this is just a great example of a nominee from a Gardeners with Heart that we'd showcase. All right, and then into step 4, let me catch up here. We have our communications plan and external. So now we have our selections finalized and we've turned into developing the external communications plan. So April 1 is always our kickoff for the statewide campaign. We start with an email launch from our statewide director and leadership announcing the Gardeners with Heart campaign, thanking every volunteer, whether or not they were nominated as a Gardeners with Heart, for the work that they're doing across California. And then we invite them to follow along as we feature volunteers and projects across the state every week with a different theme. And they're all centered on the impact of the volunteers and their work. Online, we'll post visual rich content across our blogs, across our website, everything from quotes to videos and slideshow recaps. Gardeners with Heart is also included in our impact report. I'll go into more detail on some of those items because I have some examples. All right, so here is an example of our weekly blog series, which highlights individual stories and connects them to broader impact areas. These stories really are evergreen, and we have and do continue to use them throughout the year. In the blog that you see here, it's called Hands in the Dirt, Hearts in the Community. This is a blog where we featured the reach of a Master Gardener volunteer that is really working to make gardening more accessible and inclusive. In this example, and I'll share a picture of this volunteer in the next slide, James Bassett of LA County was nominated for his work with students, many of whom have never experienced gardening or first-time gardeners through, again, LA County's Grow LA Gardens project. And he supports students by offering workshops on culturally significant crops and food systems in the Semel HCI community garden. And when we reached out to James and we said, hey, James, we're excited that you've been nominated. You're going to be recognized as a Gardeners with Heart. He replied with this amazing quote. And his quote says, one of the most rewarding aspects of my work as a Master Gardener volunteer has been engaging with school gardens. These spaces have provided an incredible opportunity to pass on a love for gardening to the next generation while introducing young people to fresh fruits and vegetables that they may not have experienced before. So you can see the type of stories and the meaning behind why people are volunteering, and not only what they're doing for their communities, but what the program has done for them as individuals. All right. A key component for our communication strategy has also been social media, and it has been integral to the success of the campaign. So we've leveraged all different types of media. Really, the video-driven has been the most successful for us. I know it's the most challenging sometimes to capture, but it has been the most engaging. Where we go out and we'll have a volunteer give a testimonial or show us their project or walk us around the garden. And it really is rich content where the volunteers can speak about the work that they're doing personally. We've also shared posts with quotes from the volunteers, stories of what they've done, or even a quote from the person who has nominated them. And if we have time at the end, we do have examples of videos and some slideshows that we can share, or those will be available in the box folder that you get at the end. Finally, we mentioned the impact report. Gardeners with Heart stories and projects are also featured throughout the report, and they showcase the depth and work the volunteers do beyond what we can capture in traditional numbers, right? So it's really the heart and the stories of the volunteers that we're able to incorporate into the impact report. And we use our impact report to talk to, fundraisers, community partners, government relations uses the impact report. So it really expands the reach of the Gardeners with Heart stories and recognizing the volunteers in every way that we can across our program. All right. For sake of time, we're not going to play the video today, but you'll be able to access it when we send out the link. In 2025, we hosted a statewide volunteer recognition celebration webinar in early April. And during the webinar, our statewide director, Missy Gable, highlighted the far-reaching impact of our volunteers, their projects. It really brought a personal, heartfelt touch to recognition efforts. And most importantly, I wanted to say that we got feedback from a volunteer, and I'll share this example on the next slide. Her name was Kathy Aikida, and she beautifully captured the spirit of the campaign. She shared with Marissa and I Thank you for all the parts you played in creating and presenting this Master Gardener Celebration webinar. It was heartwarming and inspiring to learn about such a variety of valuable projects around the state and the many exceptional volunteers who make it possible. I wanted to let you know how much I appreciated the kind and oh so unexpected recognition that you gave me for my efforts. This has been a personal passion project without any expectation of a reward. And then she goes on to say, it was a complete surprise to be featured, and the chat comments were so sweet and heartwarming. So, belatedly, thank you. I am so grateful and so honored. So, you can see just the amount of conversation through the chat that took place where volunteers were really congratulating each other, celebrating one another, getting excited about learning about the types of projects and works that volunteers are doing every day. So yeah, it just really captured the spirit of celebration, which often can feel separated being such a large state with so many counties. So yeah, it was full of excitement, encouragement, and really pride to be a Master Gardener volunteer. Even in the virtual format, it still very much felt like a strong sense of community. All right, so now that we've walked through kind of how the plan was implemented, I'll pass it over to Marissa and she'll dive into some of the outcomes and data.
Thank you, Melissa. And so, as you can see from some of the work that Melissa presented, like we were hearing from volunteers that this was strengthening their commitment to the program and strengthening their connection to the program, and that they felt celebrated not for the number of hours that they were contributing, but for the difference that they were making in their community. And they felt that recognition from both peers, fellow volunteers, and from their coordinator, which we knew was going to be important for our efforts to generate and foster belonging. But how did we do in terms of our goals, which were to ensure that we were offering more recognition opportunities to more people, especially volunteers who were early on in their service as gardeners, as Master Gardener Program volunteers? So at a glance, here's what we saw. We saw a growth in submissions over the years. So we started off with a very modest number of submissions, and then reached the peak in 2024 with 35 submissions. So as you can imagine, with over 6,000 volunteers, we had to try to figure out some ways to keep the number of submissions kind of like reasonable or actionable for our team, especially because we had a commitment to lift up the work of every single volunteer who was eligible. If they were an active volunteer in good standing, then we wanted to tell their story. So we reached that peak of 35 nominations in that 3-week window back in 2024. We did end up shortening the window a little bit in 2025 to try to make that number more manageable for us. When we compared this with our 20 nominations for our triennial Search for Excellence, we could see that there was definitely excitement, enthusiasm about submitting volunteer stories for this campaign. We have great representation across the state. So as Melissa mentioned earlier, we have 52 counties that have UC Master Gardener programs, and actually one region. So over the years, we've had 47 of those counties represented, which took some intentional effort and work to try to make sure that we were lifting up those stories, but we're really happy to distribute that effort across the state. We also saw an increase in nominee diversity. So 18% of those recognized were recognized for some effort that related to equity leadership within our program. We also had 43% of volunteers in 2020 represent working volunteers, which we know was an underrepresented group within our overall volunteer population. So we're really excited to tell the story of volunteers with careers back in 2020 and talk about how they were using their professional skills to strengthen outreach and education in their community. And we also saw a huge increase in nominations of first-year volunteers. And this really was a target area for us because we knew that first-year volunteers weren't being recognized by our tenure and status-based volunteer recognition opportunities. And we think that first-year volunteers, based on some data analysis that I did back when I was in Minnesota, can represent a more diverse group in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender than the broader volunteer population. So to get into a little bit more detail about this conversation about first-year volunteers, what you're looking at right now is a graph that displays the number of nominations over a 5-year period and tenure of those nominees in years. And as you can see, the average nominee had a tenure of 2 years, which we know represents a huge shift, a huge change in the way that we distribute volunteer recognition effort at the statewide level. So our effort worked. We were able to bring in more nominations of volunteers who were more early career, so to speak, or newer to the program, and hopefully to strengthen their retention with the program, to strengthen their satisfaction, to further motivate them to continue their impact focused work on behalf of the UC Master Gardener program and their community. So this was a really exciting finding for us. I also mentioned that we wanted to focus in 3 different areas. We wanted to focus on community impact, on mission alignment, and on personal narrative. And through a kind of qualitative analysis, and I'll share some examples here, we think that we were able to do that. We know that we got the opportunity to celebrate volunteers who were extraordinarily passionate and personally connected to the work that they were doing, and to elevate transformational and innovative projects. So on the slide here, you'll see Winnie Fong. And Winnie is a Master Gardener Program volunteer in San Mateo and San Francisco counties in the Bay Area. She was critical to designing garden education opportunity for residents of the JFK Towers, a 98-unit affordable housing senior community in San Francisco. She turned a rooftop garden into a gathering place for seniors. She's a native Cantonese speaker herself, and so she initiated a project that brings garden education in Cantonese to residents who are empowered to grow their own food, care for plants, and bond over shared tradition. So we really were able to learn about a story that Winnie has helped craft over the years, and teaching composting and working with houseplants and facilitating conversations and translating these complex concepts with like the warmth and intentionality that she brings. And so this was a story that would have gone underreported at the statewide level had we not had this opportunity to draw out those stories through the Gardeners with Heart program. And I'll just share a brief quote from her nomination. Winnie nurtured a vision that took 6 years to make a reality. For me, Winnie says, the reward is the community. It goes beyond the food that's produced. For me, it's seeing the clients connect with one another and with us, exchanging ideas, laughing, and collaborating out in the garden. It's very fun and personally rewarding. So that community impact is there, and also the impact on the volunteers themselves who are facilitating these experiences is clearly in evidence. Okay, mission alignment. So we really wanted to focus the categories that we were inviting nominations in on our mission and on our core priorities, because we felt that if we had nominations that were strongly connected to our mission and vision and our core priorities, we would be able to share those stories in a variety of different ways, which would amplify the recognition that the volunteers were receiving, and then also continue to make that case about the impact that the UC Master Gardener program has on local communities, watersheds, food systems, etc. So the story that I'll tell now is of the story of Edith Lynn. Edith is a volunteer in Santa Clara County who has been really involved in gardens inside at Elmwood Correctional Facility, which is also stewarded by our colleague on the statewide team, Catherine Udi. She's reached over 100 women who are inmates at Elmwood Correctional Facilities, and has been a part of collecting data that shows the improved well-being amongst participants in the Elmwood Correctional Facilities Gardens Inside program. Edith's work is now featured in the 2023-24 UC Master Gardener Program Impact Report, showcasing the work of volunteers working with incarcerated community members across California. So because this nomination came through, we were able to start identifying some similar projects across the state, and then develop ultimately a really great piece that ended up being in the impact report. So you could see that mission alignment. It was sort of a bottom-up process of like, oh, here's an innovative, really thoughtful project that's being done in a deliberate and careful way. And that ended up becoming a story that was a strong theme in our impact report. Here's Edith at work at Elmwood with some of the students and clientele. Finally, we wanted to talk about personal narrative, which was a strong motivation for our communications personnel on the statewide team, because they really felt like it's important to share these personal narratives because those narratives are more persuasive and more compelling than just reading about a sort of project generically. And so we really wanted to draw out detailed submissions that focused on community-based work. And our hope, again, was to reduce administrative staff burden. We would use whatever story, if there was effort put into telling that story, we wanted to find a way to lift it up and to share it on that statewide sort of stage, so to speak. So the photo that you're seeing here is of Ed Andrade, who is a volunteer in Orange County. And he was able to share after we reached out to him to say, we'd love to celebrate you. This was the nomination that we received. Is there anything that you would like to add? And he responded, I began my Master Gardener journey in 2013 after retiring as a police sergeant. I initially started taking classes at a local nursery to learn how I could maintain the overgrown school garden at my wife's elementary school. So as the kids, I shared this with the members of our statewide team, and they said that's relationship goals, as the kids say. So this was just a wonderful story that was about what brought Ed into the program, but it's the relationships with students that he's developed over the years that have really kept him engaged. He writes, during my tenure as a Master Gardener, I've been involved in other school gardens and have taught tool sharpening, pruning, grafting, and rodent abatement classes to the public, gardening clubs, and students. And so we got to learn so much about Ed, what brought him into the program, what keeps him there, and felt that this example really illustrates that personal narratives came through loud and clear, and we continue to hear from people who connect with the stories that UC Master Gardener Program volunteers are sharing. So those were the outcomes that we hoped for, that we dare I say expected, but there were also some things that we learned throughout the last 5 years that weren't as expected, but were equally welcome. So I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Marissa. Yeah, as she mentioned, we had some unexpected outcomes, or as I said earlier, some happy little accidents that we were really thrilled to see come out of the Gardeners with Heart campaign. The first one was that we really were able to capture rich content and a deep bank of people-centered stories that we could use beyond just April, that we could use throughout the year across multiple different campaigns, as well as in future years. And it also helped us develop themes or projects that were taking place locally and connect some of the counties that also, like with the Elmwood corrections, it came out that we had several counties that were working in that space to be able to tell the story in like larger communications plans. So like the impact report. So the stories have become powerful tools for program advocacy, both with our community partners, our government relations team, and working with elected officials, and during our fundraising campaigns to be able to really help communicate the impact of the Master Gardener program. All right. We also had, while we have, the volunteer recognition, we would have a story, but that story can live on and continue to inspire. And so we have, one touch, but many touch points. Here's an example of a UC Master Gardener volunteer. His name is Thurman Howard. He was nominated in 2021 and recognized as a Gardener with Heart for his work in Riverside County. And then you'll see again that he was, that his story really lived on. So Thurman was recognized for his work with the Saboba Band of Luiseño Indians. With the Saboba Band, they had been gardening for countless generations, but needed support in restoring crop yields. Together, Herman aligned tribal traditions and restored long-term garden health. And since then, since the partnership began, Eloyd Rodriguez, the Saboba Band cultural garden specialist, has even become UC Master Gardener himself. Thurman's story was then later featured in our 2022 Search for Excellence, our 2023 statewide conference, where his county and the Saboba Band team received Senate resolutions for their partnership and collaboration. And then finally in 2024, the story was also shared in our impact report. So by amplifying this one story across several years, we've reduced kind of some of the content, the strain of trying to identify and find content from local programs, and we've been able to really amplify the story across multiple communications channels. All right. Gardeners with Heart has also helped build a community. We talked about this when we showed the webinar through the comments, and we also see it on our social media channels. We see volunteers celebrating one another in the comments. We're a huge state, and sometimes the counties can feel disconnected from the larger program as a whole. In this example, we had featured Ann Liu. She's an incredible gardener, master gardener volunteer from Yolo County. Her work is at a garden called Grace Gardens, located near Davis, and is an example of how gardening can foster food access and inclusive community spaces for college students. And she openly welcomes young students into the garden space, creating a sense of a home away from home for everyone that enters. So Anne had originally been a Master Gardener volunteer in Los Angeles County, and then she had transferred to Yolo County. And so when she was identified as a Gardeners with Heart on social media, you see some of her former Master Gardener volunteers from LA chiming in, celebrating the work that she's continuing to do in her new program. And you can see through the comments and the example, just the outpouring of love and congratulations from fellow volunteers from all over the state. And then finally, the Gardeners with Heart campaign has really also become a recruitment tool for new volunteers because it showcases real work and real examples of what Master Gardeners are doing out in their community and the impacts that they're making. And it really can inspire others to want to join the program. Here we have Julian Hoyle of Ventura County. And in 2024, we created a video featuring him. He's walking around his garden and he's really showcasing an example of like, you don't have to be a garden expert. You just have to have a passion for helping people. And Julian's story really resonated so deeply with himself and his family that they reached out a year later and said, hey, can you send us a copy of that video of Julian? We really want to have we really want to be able to share this with all of our friends and family. But yeah, so Ventura is still using this video as a recruitment tool, and other programs across California can share that as well. All right, Marissa, I think we're getting close on time, but we do have some resources to share.
Yes, I'll share our link to our resources here with you all. And then I do think we have about 10 minutes for question and answer. So we know that this was a lot, and we are excited to be able to share with you a link to a survey. So we'll drop it here in the chat, and then also you can access it via this QR code. It's going to ask you just a couple of questions, your name, your institution, if you learned anything at all today. And then you'll be directed to a post survey page, which has a box folder, which has got all kinds of goodies in it. Links to some examples of some of the campaign outcomes. So to our blog, to our social media channels, and you'll also find a link to the public link of the presentation that we shared today, a couple PDF versions of different versions of this presentation. And you can certainly reach out to Melissa or myself. I'll share our contact information on the last slide if you have additional questions or if you're looking to implement a similar program in your state. Oh, I should also share there is a copy of the Qualtrics nomination survey. So if you're curious about that, you'll be able to see all of the items that we ask. And again, we try to keep it pretty succinct. We also want to name that National Volunteer Month is now, and National Volunteer Week is the 19th through the 25th. Please feel free to follow the UC Master Gardener Program social media channels. We're doing a little something different this year because it is our triennial search for excellence. And so we're telling the story of teams of volunteers that have done incredible, impactful work within their local programs or within their region. But check out the statewide blog, our Facebook, our Instagram, and we'll be excited to continue to follow the ways that you're recognizing volunteers during this National Volunteer Recognition Month. Our contact information here, and we'll leave this up for a few moments, but I think we're ready to open it up for questions. And Ashley, and thank you all again for joining us today.
Great. Yeah, we have some questions in the chat. If anybody else has any questions, you can go ahead and type in the chat now, and I'll just kind of go down the line. And then, after we do that, you can unmute as well if you'd rather just ask in person. Okay, let's see. All right. Matt asked, did the Gardeners with Heart replace the previous system with hours recognition, or was it done in conjunction with the previous system?
That's a great question, Matt. The Gardeners with Heart program doesn't replace any of our tenure-based recognition efforts. We continue to recognize volunteers as they transition from trainees to first-year Master Gardeners to Gold Badge to Platinum Badge. They continue to be able to change their badge color or even add pins to their badge to recognize their hours contributions over time. And we list volunteers in the impact report or on our webpage to recognize those milestones in terms of hours or years contributions. And then local recognition efforts really vary across the board, but they continue to host events, to assign leadership roles, and to celebrate volunteers for reaching those important milestones. So we really see the Gardeners with Heart campaign or program as part of a complete breakfast of volunteer recognition. So we think that these tenure and status-based recognition efforts are incredibly important. And we thought that there was a little something missing at the statewide level when it came to recognizing volunteers specifically for the difference that they're making in their community, regardless of tenure or sort of leadership status.
Great. So then there's kind of a follow-up. So everyone who gets nominated receives the award, or just out of all of the nominees, you select a smaller group?
Good question. I'll answer briefly and then invite Melissa to share anything that I missed. We do understand that, saying everyone who is nominated receives an award that could be pretty overwhelming. And we do get a fair number of submissions, but anyone who takes time to submit a complete submission of an eligible volunteer, so a volunteer who is active or limited active in our program, we will find some way to recognize that volunteer. It might not be a blog post for every single volunteer, but it could be a social media post, or we could, defer recognizing that volunteer until later on in the year. An example I'll give is we got a nomination of a couple of volunteers who had done really powerful work with veterans, and we said, we're going to recognize them. We're going to name them as Gardeners with Heart, but we want to wait to do a feature until it's November because that's Veterans Day. We'll be able to recognize those volunteers like powerful and impactful work most appropriately later on in the year in November. So, Melissa, is there anything that you wanted to add to that response of recognizing everyone?
I would say having the same volunteer recognized year over year. So that was one that we decided if a volunteer was recognized in 1 year that we would have a gap. And I don't recall what that number of that amount of time was in between, but that we would allow some time to recognize new folks or prioritize recognizing new volunteers instead of the same volunteer in consecutive years. Additionally, the volunteers that are working in teams. So we did see some volunteer nominations that were really closely tied together in teams. And so we really wanted to honor recognizing the individuals and the individual contributions. So we did get some submissions that were team-based, and we did have to pull out the work that individuals did as part of a team so that people were recognized individually for the Gardeners with Heart campaign. And then as Marissa mentioned, This year, because it's a search for excellence year, we are doing some small team recognition, but so that will be kind of every third year will be more team based, and then we do the individuals in other years. So that was a slight modification for this year.
Great. And can I ask, it's only the coordinators that submit these, correct? The volunteers don't submit?
We do invite submissions from coordinators, fellow volunteers, and from community members. However, before recognizing a submitted volunteer, we always communicate with the local program staff just to ensure that this is a person that they feel like is representing the program well. If there is this, fortunately, this doesn't happen often, but if there's like an ongoing sort of conflict that is being managed locally that involves that volunteer, then we may defer recognizing them in service of not wanting to, send a mixed message. So there's lots of communication with the local program coordinators who have final say when it comes to whether or not this is a volunteer that they'll be lifting up. We did also add in this last year, we requested that folks limit their nominations. Again, we have 58 counties in California, and 52 have UC Master Gardener programs currently. And so we asked that folks limit their nominations to 3 per county so that we could better manage the number of submissions and follow through on that commitment to recognize anyone that we had a complete submission for who was eligible. I see that there's a hand raised, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yep, Lauren has her hand raised. You want to unmute?
Lauren.
That's fine. I think you can unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yay. So I wanted to say another happy accident that's happening. I am an instructional designer for the office that Melissa and Marissa work for. And a happy accident that happened to me most recently is I was looking to interview master gardeners for a climate course that I am developing. And I was like, oh my gosh, we recognize some people in the Gardeners with Heart. And so I went back in time and found some and made a connection, and I'm interviewing them. And then I also went back and found some other Gardeners with Heart and uplifted their project as examples in a training of like good public outreach. So I have a course on public outreach and education, and it's actually using real master gardeners that we already featured, already had their picture, information, and everything. And we got to uplift them into trainings that we are now going to be giving to new volunteers who are onboarding and going through basic training. And it's like, it just keeps going. So it's really interesting to see how just a nomination can simply just keep growing. And then also other people are like, I want to talk to those people. I want to connect with them. I want to do a project like that. So it is becoming more inspiring than I thought it would. So happy accident.
Thank you, Lauren. I didn't know about that. That is so exciting. And I think what you're saying about the momentum, you said like it just keeps rolling, it just keeps going. And so the effort, the connection to the UC Master Gardener program mission and priorities does allow for more flexibility in terms of how these stories continue to get told. So that's really exciting.
All right, we have another hand. Donna, you have your hand up. You should be able to unmute yourself.
It was stuck and I couldn't. I am from Wyoming, and we only have Master Gardener coordinators in 6 of our 23 counties. We have a few ag educators who also kind of connect with the Master Gardeners. And then we have some counties where we don't have anybody that's necessarily coordinating the Master Gardener program. And I'm kind of looking for answers, or ideas, but how do you handle specifically this thing and otherwise connection with Master Gardeners that have been trained in counties where there is no extension personnel designated to be their touch point?
Yeah, that's a great question, Donna. We do have, so even though we have UC Master Gardener programs in 52 counties, we only have 35 staff. So we also have counties that are entirely sort of self-organized without a UC Master Gardener program or UC A&R staff member. We do continue to invite submissions from those counties. Often there is a lead volunteer or a volunteer in a leadership role that we work closely with, that we're on a first name basis with. So we do tend to communicate with those counties through volunteers, as well as if we're communicating with a volunteer, we're always going to copy an academic or staff, whether it's the office manager or the advisor who has academic oversight for the local program. It is a little bit more of a challenge, I will say, to draw out those nominations from counties that don't have staff, but we have been successful in telling stories that come out of Monterey, Santa Cruz, Glenn County, Humboldt Del Norte, counties in California that don't currently have staff members coordinating the program. Melissa, is there any specific piece of advice that you would share with Donna when it comes to working with those local programs?
I would say that it actually opens up communication to learn about what's happening locally in some of the areas where you might have gaps. Stories come out, and volunteers tend to give, when they're doing fellow nominations, a lot of really rich information. They provide very detailed nomination packets with quotes, images. So it does, I would say the quality of the submission from a volunteer and coordinator are pretty comparable to one another, regardless of, where they are. And it can help identify some of the areas, that you might not have been aware of that are happening locally, in some of those counties that are a little bit further out or don't have, a paid coordinator connected. I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, I would say that the content that you're getting back is really even just as rich. And I haven't seen a challenge compared from a volunteer leadership ran county versus a county that has a program coordinator as far as the volunteer recognition goes. But yeah, I think it's, whatever your communications channels are, if it's a direct email to all volunteers, letting them know that the window is open. So it's whatever strategy you have to communicate with folks that it's there. And then whatever capacity you have to kind of follow up with individuals that were nominated to continue to collect the information that is needed.
Okay. I also have a follow-up question. I have a master gardener who also works for a local community garden greenhouse organization. And I can see some people being impressed by her work, but would you eliminate individuals who are paid to do part of the work that is probably high quality work?
I would say that within the UC Master Gardener program, our policy would state that that paid work is ineligible for sort of volunteer hours. And so I think we'd have to have a deeper conversation, or maybe you would look at your administrative handbook or your university specific policies to look at, okay, what could be lift up here that would be appropriate. Yeah, I think there may be another opportunity to recognize this person in a community partner capacity rather than as a volunteer. So I'd have to ask some questions and learn a little bit more, Donna, before making a recommendation in this case. Melissa, if there's anything that you want to add, but I will say really quick before I turn it over to you, I'm seeing that some folks are saying, hey, the survey is redirecting me back to the survey and not taking me to a post-survey page. Sorry about that. We will troubleshoot that offline. But if you completed the survey, we have your email. And so we can email you the link to the box folder. So we will get right on top of that after we wrap here. But Melissa, any thoughts on recognizing folks who have a role in the community and then a role as a UC Master Gardener program volunteer?
Yeah, you'll see in the survey that we send out, or the nomination survey, that we really have some identified categories for which they're nominated, and that can help kind of narrow down like the types of projects that would be eligible. So you'd really have to see if it fit within some of those categories. So an example is like building communities or partnerships, or working with an audience that has been historically underrepresented, or around sustainable gardening practices. And so you would have to kind of see where their work fell into that category. And then, like Marissa said, I think if there is an element of it being a paid position versus, if they pull out the two, like which part of their volunteer service is not part of their job, that is eligible for hours, and then what is the impact of that work as a volunteer, not their career. So yeah, it would have to be kind of just an analysis of where those two things landed.
Great. Thanks for all the good questions. Yeah. I just want to mention too about the link not working. When we send out the recording, we can share that link back if you guys say, oh, it's all fixed and everything. So no one needs to remember. We'll send that back out again. Thank you all for presenting. We really appreciate it. Lots of good questions, lots of great ideas. I know I love the stories that Master Gardeners have from their work. So, I mean, I enjoy reading them and seeing them too. So definitely something I'm going to implement. Just a couple slides here at the end. If you haven't registered for your webinars for the rest of the year, this is the link here. And we'll have this recording along with all of our other EMG webinars on YouTube, and a lot of people watch them on YouTube. I think it's great to share them with other people, colleagues, whatever. If you enjoyed it, I think someone else probably might as well. So once we have the link for that, we will email it out, and then you can watch again or send it to someone else. And hopefully everyone is getting the Sprout newsletter that comes out from the National Committee. Any announcements like the next webinar is listed in that newsletter, along with other updates, timely information, and that sort of thing. And then our next webinar is in June, and we'll be talking about Community Capital's framework in the Master Gardener Volunteer Program with David Outerbridge from UF IFAS Extension in Lee County. And hopefully everybody completed the pop-up poll that Ashley put up. But that's all we have today. Thank you so much to our presenters, and thanks for everyone spending some time with us this afternoon. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks for